How did people survive in the Middle Ages when the thermometer dropped below zero and central heating was undreamed of? We imagine their life in winter as an endless, freezing torture in windswept huts. But what if the medieval English peasant, huddled in his squat, smoky house, knew something about warmth and survival that we, with our clever thermostats and double glazing, have irrevocably lost? This story will take you to a world where warmth was not a given, but an essential value, the result of daily struggle and incredible ingenuity. This is the story of how our ancestors, with nothing but clay, straw, and their own minds, turned their pitiful-looking dwellings into real fortresses against the cold. It is a tale of ingenious engineering solutions born out of desperation and a deep intuitive understanding of the laws of nature. How did they make the earth warm them from below? Why was smoke, which we consider an enemy, their main ally in keeping them warm? And what simple but now forgotten house structure could have been the difference between life and death on a frosty night? Today we're going to reveal 10 incredible ways that helped medieval English peasants not just survive the winter, but create a unique, warm microcosm inside their homes. Are you ready to learn that heating in the past was not a primitive fire starter, but a sophisticated art of survival? Then let's begin. The first and most fundamental secret of warmth in a peasant house was in its very construction. To a modern person, walls made of wattle and daub technology seemed to be the height of insecurity. We imagine the icy wind coming through the cracks, and the wall itself seems no stronger than cardboard. But this was the genius born of centuries of trial and error. Such a wall was not an inert barrier in our understanding. It was a living, breathing organism, working as a primitive but effective accumulator and regulator of heat and humidity. The walls of the hut were a framework of tightly woven flexible rods, most often willow or walnut, which formed a strong lattice. This skeleton was then thickly coated on both sides with a viscous mixture. The composition of this mixture was a real alchemy. It was based on clay, which had a high heat capacity. Chopped straw or grass was added to reinforce it to prevent cracking when it dried. Sand gave structure, and cow dung, rich in undigested fibers, served not only as an additional reinforcing element, but also as an excellent natural glue. This mixture, as it dried in the sun, became as hard as stone, but retained a microscopic porosity. It was this porosity that allowed the wall to breathe, slowly allowing air and, more importantly, moisture to pass through, preventing the accumulation of damp inside the house, the main enemy in cold climates that makes the cold pervasive. During the day when the central hearth burned inside, this massive, thick clay wall absorbed the heat slowly, over many hours. It did not reflect it like the cold stone in the Lord's castle, but greedily absorbed it, accumulated it, becoming a huge low-temperature battery. Most importantly, the peasant hut had no chimney. The smoke from the hearth did not go straight down the chimney. It slowly rose upward, creating a dense, warm lake of hot air and smoke under the roof itself. This layer gave its energy to everything it came into contact with. The thick thatched roof, which itself was an excellent insulator, the wooden beams, and, most importantly, the upper parts of the clay walls. The entire interior of the house was evenly heated, and at night when the hearth died down, the quiet magic began. The walls, which had accumulated heat during the day, slowly began to release it back into the hut. They emitted a soft, radiant heat that warmed the air in the enclosed space. This kept the temperature inside from dropping to street values, creating a safety buffer. The house seemed to exhale the heat accumulated during the day, supporting its inhabitants. In addition, creosote and other substances in the smoke deeply soaked the porous clay of the walls and thatch of the roof. This acted as a powerful antiseptic and insecticide, killing mold, fungus, and repelling insect parasites and woodworms. Thus, what seems to us a fatal flaw, the lack of a chimney and porous walls, was actually an ingenious, holistic system of passive heating, moisture regulation, and conservation of the dwelling itself. At the center of the peasant world, at the heart of the hut, was the open hearth. Not a fireplace in our sense, with its marble portal and high chimney, but a simple but vital, stone-lined recess in the earthen floor. It was not just a place for fire, it was a multifunctional survival center, the main engine of life around which absolutely everything revolved. Its design and layout were subordinated to one goal: maximum efficiency at minimum cost. The hearth was always located in the center of a single room, and this was no accident. This arrangement was critical for heat transfer. Unlike a wall fireplace, which gives off heat mainly in one direction and uselessly warms a massive exterior wall, a center hearth radiated heat energy 360 degrees around itself. The radiant heat, like the sun, spread evenly in all directions, warming the earth floor, the walls, the air, and most importantly, the bodies of people wherever they were. The whole hut became a single inhabited heating zone. People could sit around it, and everyone got his share of the precious heat. It was a place where food was cooked, and the process was an integral part of heating. Suspended on a tripod or chain, an iron cauldron with a simple meal of grain and root vegetables could boil and simmer for hours. This process itself turned the hearth into a highly efficient heat generator. The hot steam rising from the boiler moistened the winter air dried up by smoke, making it warmer in feeling and more comfortable for breathing, preventing the drying of mucous membranes. The cast iron cauldron itself and its hot contents turned into an additional heat accumulator, which continued to radiate heat long after the wood burned out. The hot ashes were used to bake unleavened cakes, roast turnips, or onions, turning cooking into a continuous heating process. The fireplace was the only source of light during the long, almost 16-hour winter nights. Its lively dancing flames cast bizarre shadows on the clay walls, creating a special, almost mystical atmosphere. It was by the light of the hearth that wool was spun, tools were mended, baskets were woven. The warmth of the fire made the fingers more nimble. The whole evening life of the family was literally confined to this little island of light and warmth. The people sat as close as they could, putting their arms, legs, and backs to the fire. Their coarse woolen clothes absorbed the warmth and smell of the smoke, and this warmth they then carried with them to their cold beds. Even after the fire was preserved for the night, the embers smoldering under a layer of ash continued to be an invisible, sacral center, a point around which the whole night life of the house was built. It was a primitive but perfectly thought-out closed system, where not a single joule of energy and not a single chip was wasted. Fuel, whether it was hard-won firewood gathered in the forest or peat cut from the bog, was the peasant's most valuable resource, which took days and weeks of hard labor to obtain. Letting the fire in the hearth burn out freely overnight was an unthinkable waste, equivalent to throwing away a sack of grain. In addition, an unattended fire was a deadly danger in a world of thatched roofs and wooden structures. Therefore, every evening, often at the signal of the church bell, curfew, from the old French couvre-feu, to cover the fire, the peasant did not extinguish the fire, but preserved it, turning it into a kind of thermal accumulator of slow action. This process was a real ritual, requiring knowledge and skill passed down from generation to generation. The owner of the house used special tongs, or more often just a pair of sturdy sticks, to select the best coals. These were not just afterburners, but dense, fully calcined, red-hot hearts of the largest logs, preferably hardwoods like oak or beech. These coals had a high density and heat capacity that allowed them to smolder for an incredibly long time. Unlike coals made of quickly burning alder or pine, he raked them into a dense, compact pile in the center of the hearth. Then the most important thing began. The coals were carefully and neatly covered with a thick, several centimeters thick layer of dry ash from previous fires. Ash, consisting of mineral non-combustible residues, is an excellent heat insulator. It worked as an ash blanket that severely restricted oxygen to the coals, stopping the open burning process, but not allowing them to go out completely. The fire would go into an extremely slow, economical smoldering mode. The ash layer had to be of ideal thickness. Too thin and the coals would eat all the oxygen and burn out in a couple of hours. Too thick and they would suffocate and cool down. Beneath this ashy sarcophagus in the heart of the hearth, an intense invisible heat persisted all through the long night. The temperature inside this heap could reach several hundred degrees Celsius. Only a small, soft, barely perceptible warmth penetrated the outside, which nevertheless kept the hut from getting completely cold. But the main advantage of this stratagem awaited the peasant on a cold, dark morning. He did not have to waste precious time and energy on starting a fire from scratch with a fire starter, flint, and rubbers, which was a long and difficult task in a damp and cold house. It was enough just to rake the ashes with a stick, and bright red, lively coals would appear. A bundle of dry moss or thin wood chips was placed on them, and the cheerful flame was instantly rekindled. This ingenious system saved fuel, prevented fires, and ensured a continuous cycle of heat in the house. One of the most efficient and unobvious sources of heat in the medieval farmhouse was the animals themselves. Many peasant dwellings, especially in the colder northern regions of England, were of the longhouse type. It was an elongated building under one common thatched roof, divided inside only by a thin wattle and daub partition into two parts: the living half for the family, hall, and the stable for the cattle, byre. For us, such a neighborhood is synonymous with unsanitation, stench, and disease. For them, it is an ingenious and often the only way to survive the winter. A large domestic animal, such as a cow or an ox, is a true biological furnace. In the process of digesting coarse plant food, its complex, multi-chambered stomach, which acts like a fermentation vat, generates enormous amounts of metabolic heat. One adult cow can produce up to 1 kilowatt of heat energy, which is comparable to a small electric heater. If a cow, a few sheep, and a couple of pigs wintered in the stable, their combined heat output was quite significant. This heat heated the air in their part of the house, and most importantly, the common partition wall between the stable and the living area. This wall, often made of the same wattle and clay, became palpably warm to the touch, turning into a large, stationary, 24/7 radiator. The family instinctively arranged their common bed by this warm wall, receiving constant passive heating from the animals. But that was not all. The floor of the stable was earthen, and it was covered with a thick layer of straw. This layer was not changed throughout the winter, only adding fresh straw on top. Animal manure and urine mixed with the bedding started a slow but sure composting process. This biothermic process also released a significant amount of heat, heating the earthen floor from below. Thus, the animals not only warmed the wall with their bodies, but also created a warm floor beneath them. Yes, the air in the hut was constantly impregnated with the pungent odor of ammonia and straw. But they got used to it from childhood, and warmth was more important than clean air. It was a perfect symbiosis, dictated by dire necessity. People gave cattle, their main capital, a roof over their heads, protecting them from frost, icy winds, and predators. The cattle, in turn, shared with people not only milk, wool, and draft power, but also the most valuable resource in winter, their vital warmth. In the harshest frosts, especially during calving season, newborn weak lambs or calves could be brought directly into the living area and laid by the hearth, where their little shivering bodies also contributed to the common cauldron of heat. The whole house worked as a single thermodynamic system, where people and animals warmed each other for common survival. The cold in the peasant's hut came primarily from the ground. The frozen, wet ground worked like a giant radiator of cold, inexorably drawing heat from everything that came into contact with it, and especially from human bodies. To fight this main enemy, peasants used the cheapest, most accessible and versatile material that the land gave them after the harvest: straw. But they didn't just throw it on the floor for softness. They intuitively created an ingenious, self-sufficient, deep-bedding biosystem that transformed the icy floor from a source of cold to a source of passive heat. The entire earthen floor in the living part of the hut was covered with a thick layer of organic materials, several tens of centimeters thick, and up to half a meter in the middle of winter. It was not only straw of cereals, but also dry ferns and eagle ferns collected on the heaths, reeds and reeds from the riverbanks, fallen autumn leaves, everything that could serve as insulation. This thick layer was not just a carpet, it was a complex, multi-layered biosystem. The top, fresh layer was regularly renewed to keep it relatively dry and clean. People walked on it, sat on it, worked on it, and slept on it. It was bouncy and springy underfoot, which in itself was more pleasant than hard, cold earth. But the real magic was happening deeper in the lower layers. There near the ground, the old stale straw mixed with the inevitable moisture rising from the soil, with spilled water, food scraps, hearth chips, and other organic waste from the family's life. In this dark, moist, and dense environment, the active process of slow rotting and composting began. Billions of thermophilic bacteria and microorganisms, breaking down cellulose, triggered an exothermic reaction, i.e., a process that releases heat. The floor of the hut began to heat itself from below. This was a weak but constant, round-the-clock geothermal heat, which created a crucial thermal barrier that cut off the icy breath of the frozen earth. The temperature on the surface of this litter was always several vital degrees higher than the bare ground, and never dropped below freezing. In spring, when the threat of frost had passed, the compost bedding, rich in nitrogen and phosphorus for many months, was raked up and brought to the fields in triumph. It was a valuable concentrated fertilizer, a guarantee of future harvests. Thus, the system performed three functions at once: insulating the floor in winter, creating a relatively comfortable and dry surface for life, and producing organic fertilizer. It was a perfect example of a waste-free, cyclical economy. Of course, such a warm and moist bed was teeming with life: mice, voles, fleas, and other insects. But in the medieval peasants' hierarchy of threats, imminent death from hypothermia was immeasurably higher than discomfort from parasites. The peasant family sleeping on freshly stuffed straw-stuffed bunks that lay on this warm straw bedding was actually in the center of a large, warm, organic cocoon, protected from the deadly cold of the earth. When the warmth of the home was limited and unreliable, the last line of defense was one's own body and what one wore. The clothing of the medieval English peasant was not just for propriety or status. It was his first and foremost line of defense against the cold. His personal, wearable heating system, which he almost never took off completely. Its remarkable effectiveness lay not in its thickness, but in two ingenious principles: clever layering and strategic use of what we would call dirt. The base, the first layer that adhered to the body, was a long undershirt made of linen. Unlike wool, linen was smooth, did not irritate the skin, and importantly absorbed sweat well, drawing it away from the body. A tunic was worn over it, and in severe cold, and two, made of coarse, prickly, homespun sheep's wool. Wool is a miracle material created by nature to survive in the cold. The secret of its warmth lies in its unique fiber structure. Each wool fiber has a natural twist, or crimp, which makes the fabric voluminous rather than flat, holding millions of tiny air pockets in its structure. It is this still air, not the fiber itself, that is the main insulator. Moreover, wool is hygroscopic. It can absorb moisture up to 30% of its weight without becoming wet to the touch, and slowly evaporates it as it continues to warm. But the main secret of effectiveness was that woolen outerwear was almost never washed, especially with harsh lye. The reason was lanolin, the natural fatty wax that coats sheep's wool. Unwashed or only lightly rinsed in cold water, wool retained this fatty layer. Lanolin made the coarse fabric practically waterproof. Drops of rain and melting snow simply rolled off it without being absorbed. In addition, the fabric impregnated with grease became much more dense and windproof, not letting in icy drafts. Such dirty clothes smelling of sheep, sweat, and smoke were much warmer and more functional than clean, fluffy, and degreased clothes. The principle of layering, linen, then 1 or 2 layers of wool, and perhaps a cloak or cape on top, created additional air layers between the layers of clothing, which worked like the packets in a modern double-glazed window. A peasant dressed in such armor wore his own warm microclimate all day long. They often slept in the same clothes they wore during the day, only removing simple leather shoes and perhaps a top coat. This prevented precious body heat from being wasted on warming a cold bed from scratch. Clothes warmed during the day by the hearth, and their own body heat became cozy pajamas and an extra layer of shared blanket at night. Climbing into a damp, cold bed, even if it was a shared family bed where several people were already lying, was a real physical shock to the body. The sudden change of temperature could cause uncontrollable shivering, cramps, and even provoke illness. To mitigate this brutal transition from the relative warmth of the hearth to the icy world of night, peasants used simple but extremely effective portable warmers, charging them like batteries from the only source of high temperature in the house, the hearth. The simplest and most common option was ordinary stone, but not any stone was suitable for this purpose. The peasants chose smooth, flat river-naked stones or pieces of dense sandstone or soapstone steatite by experience. These rocks had a high specific heat capacity, meaning they could absorb a lot of heat, and a good thermal conductivity so that they could release it slowly and evenly. Ordinary granite or flint could crack or even explode from sudden heat, which was deadly. The right stone was chosen to lie in the hot ash at the edge of the hearth for an evening, warming slowly and deeply. Before the family went to bed, the heated stone was removed from the ashes with wooden tongs or just 2 sticks, quickly wiped clean of ashes and tightly wrapped in several layers of old, worn but dense woolen or linen cloths. This was done not only to avoid getting burned, but also to create an insulating layer that slowed down heat transfer. This improvised heating pad was placed in the center of the straw mattress, 10-15 minutes before going to bed. The stone slowly and evenly gave out its dry heat, warming the straw, evaporating excess moisture from it, and creating a warm, cozy island in bed. Sometimes such a stone was placed in the feet, the coldest place, where it warmed frozen feet and remained warm for several hours. This was not just a luxury, but a vital procedure, especially for young children and the elderly, whose thermoregulation was weaker. A more advanced and safer option was a sturdy clay pot with a tightly sealed lid. It was filled with hot, glowing ashes and a few small, long smoldering coals from the hearth. Such a ceramic container gave off heat even longer and softer than stone, and eliminated the risk of a coal falling out and setting the bed on fire. It could be safely placed next to you under a blanket or passed around to the coldest member of the family. These simple technologies, based on the principle of transfer and slow release of stored heat, allowed the concentrated heat to be delivered exactly where it was most needed, and turned daily bedtime from a torture to an almost pleasant ritual. The medieval peasant used not only what was on the ground, but also the ground itself to fight the cold. Some of the earliest and simplest peasant dwellings in England were of the half-house or sunken-featured building type. This principle, when perfected, was an ingenious way of harnessing the planet's natural thermoregulation. Instead of building a house directly on the surface, peasants dug a shallow but wide excavation, 0.5 meter to 1 meter deep. The floor of the future house was much lower than the ground level. The walls were then built from the bottom of this excavation. What did it give? The Earth has a huge thermal inertia. Below the freezing depth, which is not so great in England, the ground temperature remains relatively stable all year round, staying around +5, 110°. Even at shallower depths, the ground cools and freezes much slower than the air. By sinking his house into the ground, the farmer essentially insulated most of its walls from the icy winter wind and extreme air temperatures. The walls of his house were not in contact with 10 degrees of frosty air, but with UDC or even +2 of cool, but not icy ground. This radically reduced heat loss. The wind could not blow heat through the lower part of the walls, which was the coldest and most vulnerable part of a conventional house. Such a house was sort of wrapped in the earth. This allowed the small amount of heat that the hearth and living things provided to be retained inside much more effectively. In addition, a squat, partially concealed house had a smaller wall area exposed to the winds, which also reduced convective heat loss. This simple construction trick, borrowed from the ancestors, was one of the most effective ways of passive heating, requiring no expense other than the hard labor of digging a pit. Even the warmest house gets cold in no time if there is a draft. The icy winter wind was enemy number one, and fighting it became a real war, requiring constant attention and ingenuity. The peasant turned his house into a besieged fortress, where every crevice was a potential gap in the defense. The door and window openings were the main gateways to the cold. The door, made of rough boards, never closed hermetically. Therefore, it was covered from inside with a heavy hide, cowhide or bear if you were lucky, or several layers of dense felt. This heavy curtain created a primitive vestibule, an air pocket that prevented icy air from rushing in when someone entered or exited. All the gaps around the perimeter of the doorframe were carefully caulked with moss, soot, or old rags. The windows were usually few and tiny. They were closed shut with wooden shutters for the winter, but even that was not enough. The gaps around the shutters were also plugged with any available insulating material. Often the windows were additionally covered from inside with pieces of cloth or skins. Ventilation was carried out through a smoke hole in the roof, but in strong winds or snowstorms, it was partially covered with a flat stone or board, leaving only a small slit to avoid burning. In the fall, the whole family was engaged in a total inspection and sealing of the house. Every crack in the clay walls, especially in the corners and at the base, was carefully sealed with a fresh mixture of clay and manure. The joints of the walls with the earthen floor, from where it blew especially hard, were covered with rolls of tightly twisted straw or cut-out layers of turf. Furniture also took part in the defense. The most massive chest or bench was pushed against the coldest windward wall, creating an additional barrier. This methodical, painstaking work of finding and destroying drafts was no less important than keeping the fire burning in the hearth. The last and perhaps the most important secret of winter survival lay not in technology, but in social organization. It was practically impossible to survive alone. The warmth of the community, both literally and figuratively, was the most powerful heating resource. During the coldest periods of winter, peasants practiced what might be called collective heating. Several families, especially those with small children or lonely old people, often gathered for the evening and even overnight in one, the most spacious or warmest hut. It was an ingenious solution in terms of saving resources. Instead of burning precious wood in 3 or 4 hearths, they kept the fire going in only one. The physics of this method is simple. Each human body at rest generates about 100 watts of heat. By gathering 15 to 20 people in one small hut, it was possible to get 1.5 to 2 kilowatts of living heat. This heat, together with the heat from a single hearth, was enough to keep the room at a tolerable temperature. The breathing of many people also increased the humidity of the air, making it subjectively warmer. People literally warmed each other with their presence. These evenings were not only a way to keep warm, but also an essential social ritual. Women would spin or mend clothes together by the light of a single fire. Men would repair tools, tell stories, and sing songs. This strengthened social ties and chased away the fear and gloom of long, dark nights. The community shared not only warmth, but also food and worries. If someone had a sick child, neighbors came to help, bringing not only herbs, but also the warmth of their bodies. This mutual aid, this sense of elbow, this confidence that you would not be left to freeze alone, was the most reliable shield against winter. Social warmth was no less important than physical warmth. The story of how medieval English peasants heated their homes is not a tale of cold and hardship. It is a hymn to human ingenuity, resilience, and a deep connection to nature. Without access to technology, they turned their homes into living, breathing organisms that stored heat. They used their animals as living batteries and their waste products as geothermal heaters. They learned how to conserve heat, fight the wind, and turn their own clothes into a personal heating system. But their main discovery was that the most reliable source of heat is another person and a close-knit community. Their methods were a holistic ecosystem where every element, clay, straw, dung, animal, and human, worked in perfect harmony to achieve one goal: to survive and conserve heat. As we study their experience, we realize that the most ingenious solutions often lie on the surface. They are in the ability to use what nature has given us, not fight it. Perhaps in their forgotten tricks lies not only the key to understanding the past, but also an important lesson for our future, so heavily dependent on non-renewable energy sources. If you are interested in this dive into the world of medieval survival technologies, and you want to know more about how our ancestors solved unthinkable problems for us, put a like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more incredible stories of genius born in the depths of the ages ahead of you.